Hey guys, and welcome to TikTok Therapy, our members only podcast with therapist Samantha Dalton, all about the, quite frankly, toxic and unhelpful mental health advice that is constantly being spewed at us on the internet, but from unqualified sources, and how we can counteract that in our own lives and, I don't know, do something a little bit smarter. I'm someone who's kind of always been a little critical of the mental health discourse online and the way it's been warped, as someone who has herself been to therapy and found it extremely helpful. So it's certainly not to say that therapy itself can't be helpful or that having a more lucid awareness of our own mental health isn't a good thing. But it is to say that we need to be a little bit careful about the messages that we are internalizing and especially the messages that we are sharing. My co-host for this show is Samantha Dalton, who is herself a therapist and also someone who has been pretty openly critical of some of these same, let's just say, toxic mental health norms online. Often when I saw her coming across my feed before we became mutuals, it was because she was getting screamed at by the people of TikTok for saying things that I would deem as completely reasonable common sense. But so in this 4-part series, we are going to, in each episode, break down a sort of mental health maxim that has taken on a level of virality and talk about the ways in which it's been co-opted and the ways at which we should probably be thinking about these things to live healthy, pragmatic adult lives. Now, most of the episodes of TikTok Therapy are going to be members only. So in order to access them, you can click the link in our description or you can join us over on Patreon. But this one is totally free, so you guys can all benefit from it. And just enjoy Samantha's presence without paying a dime. But before we get into this episode, as it is free, it is brought to you by one of our most beloved sponsors, and that is advisor.com. If you watch this channel or follow me, you probably know that we highly endorse working with a financial advisor. I've been working with one myself for several years now, and it has been incredibly helpful, especially in these very turbulent economic times that we live in. Just having someone I can talk to about all of my worst anxieties financially has been very helpful. You might say that a good financial advisor is a bit of a therapist of sorts, but we really love working with Advisor because they have a flat fee, fully transparent model that makes it more accessible and ensures that their advisors are working for you and not for commissions. We know their team really well. We've been working with them for a long time. We love everything they do. Very cool small business. And so we encourage you to check them out if you've ever been interested in working with a financial advisor. The link in our description will take you to a place where you can just set up a free call and ask any questions you might have about the process. Highly recommend it. It's free. What's the harm? So this week's episode is going to be all about what I like to call Venmo culture. Maybe you don't owe anyone, but everyone owes you Venmoing back and forth the same $6 coffee forever. And I think while there are definitely many egregious oversteps to asking people to financially show up in ways that aren't fair, a la wedding culture, and that's something that we'll touch on here, and there's definitely a huge backlash to that. I think there has definitely been, I think, with the rise of a lot of these payment apps, a sort of a rise of, let's be honest, a bit of cheapness, even amongst people who can afford it, and sort of losing the art of treating each other. And I think a lot of the ways that we talk about mental health and boundaries and protecting yourself often really feed into this. So first, to kick us off, Samantha, as a therapist, I would love to hear your general hot take on the rise and dominance of Venmo culture.
It's not that serious. Meaning not to you, but to the people that are constantly like Venmoing back and forth to each other. I am someone that I actually absolutely hate doing a Venmo request. Short of like we're going out to dinner and someone ordered something else or what have you. But even then, I'm not someone that's like, okay, let's get the itemized bill and go through and you actually owe $4 more than me. No. It's just not that serious to me because I feel comfortable and confident in my finances and I feel that I'm able to be flexible in that way. I'll be very open with my friends if we're going out and I'll say, hey, it's on me. Like I preface that at the beginning. But I also don't expect someone else to say it's on them. If they like put their card down, I'll say, do you want me to Venmo you? And thankfully, I have friends in my life who are like, no, don't. So I think for me, I'm very lucky to have friendships where that isn't a thing. But I have mutual friends who have friends where that's a big thing. And I think a lot of this ties into financial anxiety and fear around not only their own money and what they can or can't afford, but also this deep fear of being taken advantage of. And I think this ties into the boundaries conversation where people kind of see it as like, if you give a mouse a cookie, right? Well, what if they think I'm going to cover dinner next time? And what if they think that I'm going to have to do this for them? And they just go in this like doom spiral of what like a singular coffee or a snack or a lunch or like a movie ticket will do to them. What I've said to a couple of my clients who have come to me with this concern is being focused on what is your line in the sand. Because I think a lot of people assume that all boundary discussions need to have some sort of like really aggressive, really assertive, direct conversation. And when in reality, a lot of this can be an internal narrative, right? If there is a friend that you know is good for it, but you want to make sure you're clear in your expectation, you say, hey, I got this one, you get the next one. That eliminates the confusion if that is something that is really important to you. Or if you know there is a friend that is give a mouse a cookie, you place separate orders. Like from the get-go, you get in front of them in line and you order yours first, you pay for yours, and then you let them go. Or, at lunch, you say, yeah, separate checks, right? I think what's missing here is the nuance of you get to decide what that looks like, depending on the friendship, depending on where you're at, depending on what your needs are. It doesn't just have to be the same blanket response for everything.
I have a scalding hot take on this because I was recently sent a preposterous Venmo request. I can only say off camera what happened because there's a not zero chance that it could be viewed. But now this taps into a whole lot of identity shit for me because when it's my time, God forbid not soon, but when it's my time, I hope and think that the word from my loved ones that will most come up at my funeral is going to be that she was generous. That is the most important thing to my sense of identity because especially when you don't grow up with a lot, I think there's a real sense of like, I never ever want to be perceived as cheap. Now that's financially partly. I do like paying for things, but it's mostly like generous with time, having people over, making things for them, showing up for them, bringing gifts, like
Same.
Yeah. And like, I understand that not everyone has like a sense of like identity-based anxiety around generosity. And there's ways in which it's not always necessarily healthy. So that's also something to unpack on some day that's not today. But it does make me feel hyper sensitive to when I perceive that people are being cheap in ways that are undermining to a friendship, in ways that are undermining to honestly ease, because I don't want to be sitting at this restaurant table for 30 minutes. Like someone put it on their card and we'll figure this out later kind of vibe. But I've also noticed, because I think the sort of constant charging each other between friends for small amounts is what I think is sort of a micro example of what I see to be a more macro problem of how we're dealing with things as a culture that is under a lot of strain financially and otherwise, which is sort of fighting the easiest battles but losing the war, which is to say that like we are in a very toxic time financially for so many reasons. And for example, with things like wedding culture and life event culture, baby showers, bridesmaids, bachelorettes, all that, we've seen an explosion of what we demand of other people that never existed in previous generations, where we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars in many cases. We're not necessarily solving for that problem, nor are we solving for any of the macroeconomic problems, but we are solving for what you described, which is this very immediate sense of financial anxiety. Like we maybe can't solve all this other stuff, but we can charge each other back and forth for $7 in a way that makes us feel respected and seen and all of that. What I find to be interesting is that in my experience, the most egregious Venmo bandits, and it's not just the people I've interacted with personally, because for some reason they made that into a social feed so you can see what other people are doing. These are not people who are hurting for $7. It is never the people who are living paycheck to paycheck who are like, pay me back for that soda I bought you. It is always the people who they'll never ever notice this on their bottom line if they weren't committed to the bone to being cheap motherfuckers. And so I do wonder if this culture of constantly charging each other and losing the art of treating isn't often a way to further entrench the financial privilege of the people who have it to begin with.
Well, one of my biggest personal pet peeves are people that cosplay poverty.
Tell me more.
We're all supposed to sit there and pretend that we don't know the job you have and the things that you do. And the fact that you're, dual income, more likely than not, no kids. And I've had people in my life in the past who have operated that way. And I just find it really frustrating. Like, just don't try to tell me that you're being frugal when you're just cheap. Like, yeah. Those are two different realms. If you want to tell me that you really value like financial security and you have all of these goals that you want to hit and there's no room for flexibility while you're focused on these financial goals, fine, whatever, I can tolerate that. But when you're just cheap and you just think hoarding means you're good at managing money, I have a really hard time with that, because I've also found in my life that a lot of people that I've interacted with who had the least were the most generous. And I have found that the people that had sometimes the least time, the least amount of money, the least amount of connections, whatever adjective you want to put to that, were often the ones in my life that have been the most generous to me. And like you said, some of the people who were the most comfortable and the most well off just can't be bothered. And I get really frustrated when we're all supposed to act like someone is put out when like everybody in the circle knows. That's frustrating for me.
I think part of the correlation between having more financial ease and feeling less, frankly, ashamed of being a cheap MFer is you don't have a sense of stigma or anxiety about being perceived as poor. I think in many cases, because like, to be clear, it is very brokey energy to be like, I got a round of drinks and then charged you for it. But if you're someone who has always been financially comfortable, you don't have weird baggage about someone's going to think that I can't afford this. Whereas I think for a lot of people, there is a sense of like, I don't want to be perceived, or maybe socially I can't afford to be perceived. Like, for example, if you're in a space and let's say you're not white and most of the people in the space is that going to then reflect on you in a way that feeds into stereotypes that they might have about you? Or if you're, someone who comes from, a low income background, or you're someone who's younger than everyone, like if there are already any factors socially working against you, there's automatically so much more of a social cost for being perceived as not just cheap necessarily, but as poor, as someone who can't afford to treat. So I do think that plays into it. But I also think that and this I think is also partially in sort of the you don't owe anyone epidemic, which is, like you said, like this real defensiveness and territorialness that people have now that I think has been really, really ratcheted up in the past 20 years of people feeling taken advantage of in any way, inconvenienced in any way, doing something that isn't fair, the accounts not being balanced in any way. And I think that there's an obvious economic explanation to that, which is that people are more squeezed than ever financially in terms of time, in terms of energy. That's all true. But just like, refusing to pick a friend up at the airport is not a solution to a culture that's, bearing down on us, it actually only makes us more atomized and more, vulnerable. I think similarly, like these answers of being very cheap with each other, even when we can afford not to be, is like, it's not actually helping anything. And even if it makes you feel a sense of justice in the short term because you weren't out $6 extra, it probably only hurts you in the long run.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you find yourself fearful of really any of this, right? Like any of this, like I'm being put out, I'm being taken advantage of, I'm fearful of people taking my money, I think one of the very sinister underlying issues with so much of this mental health content, this blanket statement, black and white mental health content, is that a lot of people haven't actually experienced a lot of these issues. They are trying to implement a lot of this stuff on the back end to try to avoid any of these things happening. this idea of feeling taken advantage of, this idea of being let down, being hurt, being disappointed, being inconvenienced. I think a lot of it, like, sure, anybody who's lived life has been disappointed by a friend or felt frustrated or, whatever. Negativity is a natural part of the human experience. But I think a lot of people see this stuff, feel anxious that it might happen to them. And so they interpret all of this rigidity in how they live their life. And really what it is it's just this anxious desire to try to control and mitigate any pain and discomfort on our end. And we're feeling frustrated because we're like, well, I'm doing all of this stuff over here. Why isn't anything getting better? And it's like, well, you're not allowing anything to literally be nuanced. You are assuming that everything is a direct threat to you because you're worried of what the fallout or experience might be if that does happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there is a feeling that that human interactions are, a computer program, and that if you enter the right codes in the right order, that you're going to be able to avoid a situation that, to your point, makes you feel things you don't want to feel. But I think, to go back to like the wedding stuff and the way that our life moments are now encroaching on other people's finances in a way that they haven't historically. I am of the somewhat unpopular in the personal finance space opinion that, generally speaking, building wealth, making real changes with money, changing socioeconomic class, all of those things, getting out of debt, generally speaking, don't happen in the margins. Yeah, I mean, if you're hemorrhaging money every day on, $20 chopped salads at the office, like, yeah, that becomes a macro issue. But generally speaking, whether or not you build wealth is not going to come down to whether or not you have a Netflix subscription. It's not going to come down to these very small decisions that we make, again, unless they're being made at a really unsustainable scale, which is in and of itself a bigger issue than just the coffee. That's more of like a mental issue. It's a lifestyle issue, all of these things. But generally speaking, for a lot of people, it's going to come down to maybe changing jobs. It's going to come down to, the house that you buy, the car that you buy, these macro choices that have, whether or not you invest in the market, like all of these things that are kind of on a broader level, but that feel, I think, that aren't moralized necessarily in the same way, where we've gotten really good at moralizing these tiny financial micro moments, and really policing each other and policing ourselves on these tiny moments. And it's very interesting to me that even with this explosion in sort of micro accounting between friends, between family members, even between all of these different relationships, I even see married couples doing it. And I'm like, get a grip. Truly, like, what is even the benefit of being married at this point if you're having to Venmo each other for a breakfast sandwich? Good Lord. But I think it's interesting that that is not considered socially taboo necessarily, but it would be considered socially taboo to say, I'm not showing up to your wedding because I can't afford to go to a 5-star resort in Mexico. And it's insane to expect that of people, so thoughts?
Many. I hope I can keep track of them. But yeah, I think if we use like this idea of wedding culture, right, to kind of speak to this larger issue of building wealth, we could have a much larger conversation, I think, than you would speak even better to this than me as someone in the financial space. But I think questioning like the need or the purpose for the level and magnitude of wedding and celebration that we are seeing from people. Because let me tell you, as someone that specializes in working with millennial and Gen Z women, the amount of weddings that I have coached people through, both people who it was their own and people who were a part of it, it has done people in. The level of detail, the expectation, the cost, the drama, that this friend isn't following through on this one went back on that, this one isn't doing this isn't, like, it is overwhelming. And as someone who has not yet been married, I can tell you at this point, my wedding is going to have 5 people at it. After the amount of scenarios and situations that I have seen people try to navigate through, one of the big things that would always come up were like the bachelorettes. That was a big thing. And something that I would always tell people is, if you decide that you want something extravagant, you cannot have an ounce of negativity towards the people that are honest with you up front and say they can't go. You have to accept that there will probably be a significant amount of people who say no to you. And the natural consequence of that is you don't get to be mad, because if someone is willing to be vulnerable and honest up front and say, look, I cannot swing the 5-star resort in Mexico. I cannot do it. I cannot swing a week in Paris. I cannot do it. That was the natural consequence of the decision you made to have something that was on the end of extravagance. Now, the nuance that I add is we start opening up the door to legitimate frustration and anger when someone says they can do it, gets way into the process, and then changes their mind, right? That's when we can start to say, okay, that's a little bit frustrating. But I think all of this is even like a larger issue related to nobody actually understands what a boundary is. And I know that word like comes up a lot, but it's just so key to so many of these things that we're talking about. Not boundaries aren't just like what you expect from other people. Boundaries are also what you expect from yourself.
Thank you.
This has become so self-absorbed in assuming that this is always about preventing somebody else from doing something to us. A lot of this is being honest from the get-go to say to your dear friend, I'm not going to be able to do this for the wedding. And maybe following up with, I can do XYZ, I will not be able to do ABC. But that is a boundary within yourself that you're willing to sit down and prep out the numbers beforehand and decide what you can and cannot do. And then be willing to sit in that discomfort of being honest about where you're at. To have a boundary with yourself is to have expectations of yourself and how you'll behave. And I think that is something that gets lost in the sauce a lot with all of this, right? So going all the way back to the very beginning where we talk about, the in perpetuity Venmo tennis match, you have to decide what matters to you. Exactly like you said, Chelsea, when you said, I am hell-bent on the word generous being the number one adjective that gets thrown around upon my death, right? That tells me that you have a very deep, innate sense of understanding of what your value system is. And I think part of what is causing so much of this tension and confusion with so many people is no one's taken the time to figure out what they care about being in their life. So they are confused, like, well, am I super like frugal and responsible with my money, or am I actually generous, right? Like, do I actually care about this or do I not? But the problem is in the middle is now they're being told all of this information about what could happen if you are this or you aren't that. And so it's going back to that idea of trying to prevent it before it even happens. And it ends up just being a giant mess. When really what you need is like a week-long vacation by yourself to think about like what even matters to you.
I think one of the biggest issues is that we have now entered a weird liminal space because let's be very clear. Up until pretty recently in human history, people generally only socialized with other people from their same socioeconomic class. They were sorted. We've all seen Titanic. Your asses weren't even on the same floor. Like you're not going to the same dinners. You're not celebrating each other's birthdays. You just did not socialize with people outside of your social class for the most part.
And you didn't know what anybody else was doing.
Exactly. And Titanic, my one historical reference, upstairs, you're in a cigar lounge, you're having 8-course meals, you're eating caviar. Downstairs, you're playing a fiddle and dancing and throwing back beers. Okay, so you would never have except in the one dinner where Jack went up to first class and was eating with all those people. I say all of this to say, I think we're in a weird era where we're sort of having to constantly engage in like a low grade form of denial because we're socializing across all different socioeconomic brackets with all different abilities, expecting things of each other. And quite honestly, I think that's part of the reason why people who have means to not be cheap are allowing themselves to be cheap because they're socializing with people who really can't afford that shit. Yeah. For whom it would be something totally different. Like, this is an unpopular opinion. I'm going to die on this hill. Past a certain socioeconomic status, if you're bringing people out to your birthday dinner, I think you should pay for your birthday dinner. Like, you should pay for at least part of it. You should pay for the drinks. You should pre-order food and pay for that. Like, you should be treating other people. I don't like when I'm at these rich motherfuckers' birthday parties and I'm expected to not only pay for myself, but cover them. Pass.
No.
Pass. No, like when you're 22 and passing the hat and you're like, okay, it's Sarah's birthday. Like, we all have to pitch in because, you know, she can't afford it or whatever. Like, fine. But like, why are you as a 40-year-old who makes, you know, who works in big law expecting people to pay for your birthday dinner? You should be throwing a party and you should be paying for it. Like that. And by the way, that's historically how it always would have been done in higher socioeconomic brackets up until probably like 30, 40 years ago. Like, you would not ever, as a rich person, have a birthday celebration and then expect everyone to whip out their own money and to cover you. And I do think that there is this sense, like, so much of the tension to me inherently stems from the fact that people are socializing across all different economic situations. And some people really do have to be self-protective and really do have to count and feel, you know, I've seen situations where people who really don't have money like that are getting stuck with a bill and then having to chase people down on Venmo. And like, that sucks.
Yeah.
And that is something where you absolutely are well within your rights to be like, hey, this isn't really fair. Like, can we all pitch in? But that same sort of social logic is being used to allow people who totally have the means to just abandon a core part of friendship and a core part of human community, which is covering each other and getting the next round and you get me next time.
It's so frustrating because I think what's hard for me to watch sometimes when I have clients come to me with, really this comes down to like any issue in the modern age. But I think there is so much fear around being honest about our circumstances for the same exact reason that you just laid out, right? Everybody is trying to be performative to everybody. Everybody is trying to pretend that they're not in the situation that they're in, that they are in fact better off than they are, whether they're comfortable with doing that or not. And there's a lot of feeling behind. A lot of what I hear women specifically say is they feel behind financially. They feel that they've been, you know, burdened financially. So many times I just say to them, like, what feels so uncomfortable about being honest with your situation from the get-go? And if you can't afford to throw down your card, don't do it. Like, be honest with people and say, I can't do that right now. Can someone else get it? I promise I will make up for that, just as you said, down the line, but I can't right now. But I think so many people are terrified to own their situation for fear of what that perception will mean. Because, you know, earlier you brought up the example of like the stereotypes being reconfirmed, or people making fun of us, or people isolating us, or people no longer inviting us to things because they think we can't, you know, afford something or do something. It's frustrating, like how little patience and trust we all have with each other right now. The word trust comes to my mind, especially I think thinking of this idea of a Venmo, right? Because if you're doing that back and forth, you don't have a sense of trust that the other person is going to in fact get you the next time. And that just, it's sad, I think.
That is a really good point, is that you're explicitly saying, like, I don't trust that you're going to remember to do this or do it for me, you know, because there are many, we've all been there. We're not even finished getting home and ding, Venmo shows up right in your thing. I was like, okay, guys, like, what are you going to come to my house and take it out of my wallet? Give me a second. I just got home. I'm like literally still on the subway. And I do think you're right that speaks to a level of scarcity. Like, give people a day. And also, like, because there is such a pleasure in allowing people to remember things, to prioritize you, to like, it's nice to not feel like you're having to chase people down. That's also a gift that we give ourselves socially, is trusting the other person that they're good for it. And that's also part of what friendship is. And like, for example, the other day, I was at a place that was very inconveniently located, period. No, it was inconveniently located to my home. And I knew I was with someone who's a neighbor of mine. So I said, hey, I'm going to get, because it was like, there's many situations like this in New York City where it's a 25-minute car and an hour and 10-minute train, especially at night. Right now, these trains are a mess. So I say to my friend, we're about to leave an event. I say, hey, I'm going to grab a taxi to go home. Do you want to hop in? And she says, yeah, I'd love to. We get in the taxi, we go home, drop her off. I'm not even done with my washing my face, text, hey, how much do I owe you for that taxi? I say, you don't owe me anything because I told you I'm getting this taxi home. Do you want to hop into it? Now, could I have shaken her down for $25? Sure could have. But I actually think that the benefit of getting $25 from her would have not been at all worth the cost of what I would consider to be cheap behavior, which is saying, hey, I'm doing this thing. Do you want to ride with me? And then charging the person for it. And on top of that, there's something very pleasant and socially affirming about someone who wasn't necessarily expected to offering to pay. And I think that is also like you said, we're so eager to dispel any possibility of feeling inconvenienced or forgotten or imbalanced that we rob ourselves of these moments of spontaneous generosity.
Also, just as a side note, speaking to the cab conversation, the whole reason I work in life is to have comfort. I am a convenience queen. If it is easier to get the cab, to get the Uber, that is the choice we are making. If you want friendship and community, you have to be willing to sacrifice to get that. Like for you right there, you just built trust with that friend. Obviously, there was already trust there. But now that's been even more solidified by what you decided to do and how you manage that. If you are that worried about being taken advantage of, that is an indicator that you are just really, really bad at boundaries. You shouldn't be that terrified of someone asking you of something. That probably means you feel like you don't really have a backbone and you're just going to say yes to everything, or you're never going to have a difficult conversation. Because for people who are really boundaried and are really clear on that, they're not afraid of that. Because if you weren't interested in having someone ride in a cab with you, you wouldn't have offered, right? Like if you weren't interested in splitting or sharing something with someone, you wouldn't have offered. And I think that I want to, like, whoever's watching this, like, I want to give you the confidence to lean into trusting your own self, that you will protect yourself if the situation arises. And to stop assuming that because we covered something, even if nobody ever covers for you again, you still did something that contributed to the friendship, to the connection, to the building of vulnerability and community, and being okay and confident in that. Not worrying about how that's going to bite you in the ass down the road, but that you were just willing to do that because it's what you wanted to do. I think there's so much like fear and anxiety and worry about what will happen if I don't. And it's just, at the end of the day, it's all just more exhausting than if you just didn't send the Venmo request.
I totally agree. And I think that's a great note to leave it on. Thank you so much, Samantha, for joining. Where should people go to follow you?
You can follow me on TikTok and Instagram at Sam the Therapist. I have a podcast called Nuance Needed, where we get into conversations just like this all the time. And I also have a Substack also called Nuance Needed.
We love it. Samantha is real as hell. Love her. You got to come to New York because I feel like we would just really vibe in person.
Don't twist my arm. I'll be there.
Twist in right away. Okay. And as I mentioned, guys, this is a podcast primarily for our members. So if you would like to see the other 3 episodes of TikTok Therapy, just go ahead and click the link in our description. You can also find us on Patreon, join button, wherever you want to engage with our membership. We have tons of other exclusive podcasts and lots of other cool stuff for our members. We also do monthly workshops. So join. We'll see you there. Bye, guys.